Hey everyone, you are listening to episode 12 of the Casual Historian podcast. In this episode, my co-host James and I talk about the disappearance of political centrism in the Western world and the historical influences that have led to it. If you enjoy this episode, then I would ask that you give us a rating and a review on iTunes or any other podcasting service that offers such a feature. Sharing the existence of this podcast on social media and elsewhere on the web would also be greatly appreciated. If you want more content like this, then you can go to casualhistorian.com, where I publish more history-related content. But for now, enjoy the show. I'm trying to think of a casual way to start this.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Casual Historian.
It's casual for us, right? Indubitably, good sir.
Yo, what's up? Welcome to today's episode of the Casual Historian. I'm here with my boy James. I can't do that authentically, can I?
No. Well, since things have been said, so I guess another week has gone by, and so how are you doing?
The politics of American, British, European theater, and Australian, by the way, has increasingly become entertaining. As I think we're literally watching one of those moments in history where a large-scale political realignment is very likely in the offing.
Yeah, that's, I would say this current political realignment has been going on for quite some time. It's just been, well, realigning takes time to do. So,
you're absolutely right. I think that probably we can chart this realignment back to, I'm going to say 2008, thereabouts.
I would actually be willing to go a little further back, at least in terms of the United States. I'm thinking this realignment is going on since at least like 1992, or at least I know in many, if you take your average poli-sci 101 course in the United States, they'll often tell you that we've been in a period of de-alignment since like the 90s. More and more people are choosing not to associate with a particular political group rather than associate with a new political group.
I think that's part of the peculiarity of the American system. And I think that in many ways that is indicative of the realignments that are happening elsewhere on the world. Part of the peculiarity of American politics is that we only have two giant institutions of political parties, whereas in most other democracies there are multiple parties, where people who feel disaffected with one are able to move to one that suits their ideology. Very rarely nowadays in America, especially right now, would you find many people willing to cross straight from Democrat to Republican. And even though there is, that Libertarian Party in the it is one of the third parties in the United States. It's more so a right libertarian party. So left-wingers feeling disaffected by the Democratic Party might not really feel at home in the American Libertarian Party. By the same token, they might feel that the Greens don't speak enough to the needs, or they might not view the Greens as politically viable enough to waste their time on. So many will simply, I'm out.
Well, the Greens have all the solutions, don't you know? You just need to use quantitative easing and limit your exposure to Wi-Fi, and that solves all your problems.
Okay, so quantitative easing can be useful at times, but we're not here to talk about quantitative easing. We're actually talking about part of the nature of this realignment, and a big feature of it across the United States, across the British Isles, in Europe, in Australia, is the gradual erosion of the establishment parties, especially establishment parties of the center and left, and what is filling those voids.
My thoughts on this, and once again, I am much more knowledgeable with American politics, but overall, I know what's fueled sort of the disappearing center in American politics, and I think this might have something to do, at least in part, with the rest of the world, is the growth of executive power that it's been going on, I would say, for 100 years in general, but even beyond that, you could even say we've been seeing more and more focus going to power in states being centered into a single institution or individual for about 500 years.
Well, I think that, a big part of that is that we've been seeing the growth of nation states for about 500 years. Mm-hmm. Europe looks like somebody dropped a very colorful plate, if you were to look at a map of Europe. And the erosion of small-scale feudal states and their fusion into larger states, especially looking at countries like Spain, Italy, Germany, France, the UK, an abortive attempt at one in the Low Countries. History does kind of point to this trend, but in more so in the last 200 years, at the end of the Age of Revolution, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the predominant trend was either a return to absolute monarchy or the adoption of parliamentary systems. And throughout the 19th century, what we saw was this gradual erosion of absolute monarchies in favor of parliamentary systems in places where monarchies embraced this, like, say, the Netherlands, or eventually in Spain. The monarchies are still around today. In places where they did not do so, France, and France, and France again, those monarchies have fallen by the wayside. But when we talk about the left, the right, the center, I think that the 19th century, the late 18th century is a good place to start. Mm-hmm. So the terms we have, left, right, center, and whatnot, did not come so much from why do we call progressives leftists? Why do we call conservatives right wing? This comes from the old the National Assembly that was created at the beginning of the French Revolution, where the chair of the assembly sat at the head of the chamber, and to his left were the Jacobins, who were much more radical, and on the speaker's right were more conservative groups who were like, yeah, revolution's okay, but let's not cut off too many people's heads. Needless to say, this configuration of the assembly did not last long because of the terror, but it does provide a metric. Basically, the right is the party of relative stability. The party is the right of the status quo in many ways, and the left is the party or the grouping of change. And over time, we see this shift, and especially this gets confusing when you superimpose actual parties onto these roles, because as time has gone by, especially in the U.S., our parties have kind of engaged in this do-si-do around the political center as to where they fall. So I think also it's important to note when we say left, right, and center that we should probably not use those terms as much, because there are at least three distinct political traditions in Western politics, and even outside of Western politics. Where Western politics was influenced, like in Japan or in India, that we see the same arrangement. So the oldest of these traditions, I would say, is conservatism, and that makes sense. Conservatism is the party of keep things as they are. In many ways, this is identified as the party of vested interest, be it maintaining the old aristocracies or monarchical privileges in pre-20th century Europe, be it maintaining the rights of tycoon capitalists at times. The Conservative Party has always been the keep things as they are party, with some notable exceptions, but in general, that's conservatism.
Do we want to go to between the two, or do you want to go to the other extreme of this?
Well, I'll go in chronological order.
All right.
So the next great tradition is liberalism. Now, for my fellow Americans, I know this is going to blow your minds. Liberalism is not inherently left-wing. On the 19th century scale, yes, it probably was a bit left-wing. Liberalism was much more concerned about certain facets such as individual freedom, challenging the notion of vested interests such as the aristocracy. So the French Revolution, for example, is a liberal revolution. The revolutions of 1848 in Europe are liberal revolutions. The American Revolution is a liberal revolution. It is about saying, if you have this power, by what justification do you have it? And is it justifiable the way that you use it? So liberalism, especially in the 19th century, was more concerned about expanding individual rights. It was concerned about things like expanding voter rights, expanding the franchise, ending weighted representation for the richest or aristocrats. It was concerned with eventually taking up the cause of women's suffrage. In many of the world, it was a challenger to colonialism. It was an anti-slavery movement, though there were conservative elements that were also anti-slavery. It was the liberal wing. And so back in the United States, the Republican Party, the radical Republican Party, as it appeared, was a liberal party.
The more and more I got involved with politics before, the more I began to just dislike labels in general, not the millennial reason of, oh, I don't like being labeled kind of thing, but more along the lines of just that they're always terrible descriptors, because even in terms of conservative, conserve the old order. Well, then does that mean, say, you could have called Barack Obama a conservative while he was in office? He was preserving his order. Could you call Democrats right now conservatives because they want to preserve the Obama order?
Well, there was a British politician by the name of Ramsay MacDonald who actually raised that dilemma, in that if you are a radical and you get the things you want done, you then find yourself in the position of having to defend them, which would make you a conservative. Humorously enough, Ramsay MacDonald was a Labour politician who was expelled from his party and continued to serve as prime minister, leading a coalition of conservatives. So he may not be the best example of this, but he does originate from the third great political tradition. And this is one that Americans will be least familiar with because it never made much headway here, and that is socialism. Socialism was born out of workers' movements in Europe in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And I do want to say right now, just to be clear, socialism is a much more broad term than we sometimes apply to it today. Socialists are not inherently Marxists, and they're definitely not inherently communists, or worst, Stalinist, or Leninist, or Maoist. Socialism is basically concerned with the issues of workers' rights, and much of it was born out of the immediate concerns of the manner in which the early industrialized world treated workers, which was pretty awful. It was terrible. The idea was that people who are working should have political representation to meet their expectations and needs, because at the time, neither the conservatives, who were very much, more so a vested interest party, or the liberals, who were like, well, how can we say no if it's their right to do so? Socialism formed the third challenge to this. It doesn't really happen as much in the United States for very many reasons. Socialism itself as a political force, though it existed from the late 19th century, did not really make it into national governments as a force really until around the time of World War II and afterward. So I think that, as we examine these parties and their interactions, we then start to see how this framework that kind of developed. You have conservatives on the right, eventually socialists on the left, although again, because these are broad terms, they do overlap at times. And then liberals, who by the early to mid 20th century tend to get squeezed out, end up functioning as a floating third party. And then, of course, others like, the Green Movement, the Libertarian movements. But they're more peripheral. They've not yet been able to directly make an impact on either national or international politics in their own right. Except for maybe like in Australia or in Germany.
Yeah. So I guess now that we've covered these three political traditions, I guess now we want to get to the question at hand that we had for today was why the center parties, in particular, you want to emphasize the center left, have not been able to hold on.
Yeah. So a big part of this is, I think, that when certain achievements are made in politics, whether or not a person agrees with them, they become institutionalized. They become virtually apolitical. They might become political footballs, but many of them tend to stick around. In the U.S., a key example of this is Roosevelt's New Deal, a weird hybrid of liberal and socialist policies. It formed the basis of much of the way America functioned after the war. and into the late 1970s and 80s, early 80s. Until that consensus was then challenged. And we have a similar system in the UK. Clement Attlee's Labour, a socialist government, introduces a wide range of policies. That consensus is in place until the 80s. And so I think maybe one of the questions we look at is what the heck happened in the 80s? Because, Roosevelt's New Deal as well as Attlee's post-war state pretty much remained static. Across administrations of either of any political persuasion. In the U.S., we have alternating Democrat, Republican administrations. In the U.K., Labour and Conservative administrations, but little really changes institutionally with these until the 1980s. In the 1980s, we have a big new bit of revolutionary thought on the scene, and this time revolution comes from the conservative side. A few politicians like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan began to increasingly espouse economic ideas associated with Friedrich Hayek, who was basically the economic spirit animal of many modern right libertarians, which was that the state is far too overreaching and it needs to withdraw, and that capitalism is good in its own right. So Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher pursued policies along these lines, drastically rolling back the power of the state, crushing organized labor in many cases, which set the stage. By the end of the 1980s, there were still elements of the old post-war frameworks left, but they were skeletal structures. Much of their dressing and whatnot had been stripped away. And I will say this, that there was a great need for reform of these institutions. And many of these things needed to be either radically changed or stripped away. The trouble with Reagan and Thatcher was that they were very good at destroying, but they did not create anything to take their places, and nor would they, because in their view, the state did not need to, nor should it. But this also had an effect on the left. The left-wing parties in Europe, for example, where this took place, began moving further and further to the center, increasingly accepting that what the achievements of, such as they were, of Reagan and Thatcher were that they could not be overturned. So the idea was to manage the system as best they could. So from this, you end up with leaders like in the 90s, Bill Clinton or Tony Blair, who, while ostensibly left-wing, when you look at their policies, you look at their records in office, while they did do some things that one might identify as being left-wing, overall, they were completely in lockstep with the new conservatism that had been introduced under Reagan, under Thatcher.
It's someone who's coming from the more right libertarian perspective. I can tell you one of the thoughts on that is many of us didn't see Clinton going towards the center. From a lot of us, it's that, no, everything's actually been going further to the left, including the Republican Party has also gone further to the left. I mean, Ronald Reagan was a staunch defender of the New Deal programs. He was a New Deal guy. FDR was his favorite president. In fact, he had been a Democrat until the 1960s when he said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. Because the Democratic Party was going even further to the left. So I think this sort of response, I would say yes, the Democrats had gone at least further to the left after the 1980s in response to Reagan.
Well, no. What actually happened was the Democrats during the 1980s and beforehand were left-wing, or at least left of center, certainly. Jimmy Carter is an example of this. The problem was that during the 1980s across the industrialized world where open democracy was the norm, the left and the center left entered a period of crisis, and voters increasingly were distrustful of left-wing parties. And the 80s, in large part, is a period of the wilderness for left-wing parties in the United States and places like the UK. France is probably the one exception. Oh, incidentally, France is the weird place where every party calls itself left-wing because of its association with revolutionary tradition, no matter how conservative it really is. But we see this general surrender on the left because in many places the left spent a great deal of its time fighting with itself rather than challenging the new ideas. And voters also saw the left as trying to prop up a system that was increasingly moribund, increasingly unwieldy and unable to respond to people's needs. And so people voting for Reagan or Thatcher during the 80s were doing so as a kind of a vote for change. Like I said, this was a revolution that was brought on from the right of politics. There's another dimension as well that also shifted things, and that was the issue of social issues. Things like racial equality and integration, eventually things like second and third wave feminism, gay and lesbian liberation movements. When these became political, this also provoked a small-scale realignment. Gradually, I mean, the Republican Party in the United States was a party that very proudly proclaims its ancestry with Abraham Lincoln, who freed the slaves. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the part of the political tradition. Democrats of Lincoln's time were pro-slavery and largely supported secession from the Union and the Civil War that followed. Now, 100 years later, the situation gradually reverses. Democrats increasingly become identified with civil rights, first for African Americans and for other groups, including Latinos, Asian Americans, its association with modern feminism, the gay and lesbian liberation. Meanwhile, the conservatives gradually become economically liberal, but socially conservative as well, more of an identifier, and that was what was known as Reagan's coalition during the 1980s. I think that also another change was, especially in places where there are socialist parties. Socialist parties were inextricably linked with labor unions and working people. In fact, in the UK, for example, it wasn't uncommon for senior labor politicians to have been people who came out of the steel mills, came out of the coal mines. Increasingly, by the time I get to the 1980s, they are certainly middle class, have very little, if any, first generation working class roots, and became more, as we moved toward the center, appropriated more of what was old liberal territory. The metropolitan bourgeoisie, which increasingly alienated to an extent working class people. Who tend to be economically progressive or very in favor of socialist policies, but because of their culture, are still somewhat socially conservative. And we've seen a similar tension in the U.S., where the Democratic Party was a coalition both of large city coastal liberals, but also tended to speak strongly for working class people in, say, Pennsylvania, Ohio, the Great Lakes states. As this coalition broke down, we saw that far from having no place to go, working class people were quite willing to cast votes elsewhere.
I think I mentioned this earlier, but I think the biggest reason why we've seen the disappearance of these center parties has to do with the concentration of power within the government. More and more so around the world, we have seen more and more power concentrated into the central government, and within the central government itself, concentrated into a single individual or institution. In the U.S., we've seen the presidency become far more powerful than it was ever intended to be. And I think one of the reasons why this has created this lack of centrism is largely because there's too much at stake. Whoever gets control of the executive branch, they can do so many things now without the approval of the legislative branch and possibly even defying the judicial branch. It's happened before. So that's the big reason I would say why we have this lack of centrism in politics today, is because there's too much. Everyone sees it as there's too much at stake to let anything other than your guy have power.
Well, I think that we do see a lot of centrism in modern politics. A lot of it, actually. Maybe even too much. And this is coming from me, a centrist. In the same way that during the 1990s, the parties, beginning of the 1980s and completing during the 1990s, the parties associated with the left moved to the center. Parties on the right dealt with their own weird squabbles, and much of their leadership moved toward the center as well. So, for example, when you look at George W. Bush's administration, following Bill Clinton's in the United States, and then into Barack Obama's, there's a strong sense of continuity of policy, really. across the board.
At the very least, in terms of foreign policy, definitely is strong continuity.
And that's attach a left or right moniker to foreign policy, but it was certainly a continuation of the pretense that America was a sole superpower in the world, with unfettered rights to intervene wherever it likes. Bush really ushered that in with giving the finger to the UN in 2003 to invade Iraq, and Obama kind of certainly persisted with that in terms of the way the intervention in Libya was handled. Even if it was multilateral, it was mismanaged and had no international mandate. But in terms of economic policy, the framework, the economic framework, was unchanged. There was no challenge to it. It was still a neoliberal economic base, sometimes dressed up with social programs. I mean, here's an example of the fact that the left-wing parties had moved to the center. Barack Obama's flagship policy was the introduction of the Affordable Care Act. In the House of Representatives, where Democrats had the majority from 2009 to 2011, there was a public option that was included, where every American would be guaranteed health insurance via a federally sponsored system. This system died in the Senate, which was also a place with a Democratic majority. Democratic senators said no, they didn't want to embrace this policy. Cost would have been an issue, certainly, but it certainly wasn't the daring approach that Clement Attlee's government in 1945 had, where it was like, yes, we are universal health care, free the point of access for every Briton, done. What we got was actually based on a policy paper that was created in the Heritage Foundation in the 1990s, which, as as many listeners know, was a right-wing think tank. So the Affordable Care Act, the signature policy of a president that many have maligned as being, or accused of being communist, was in fact the brainchild of a conservative think tank. Another part of this, I think, also is technocracy. Increasingly, we've relied on the civil service to manage and advise policy, as justifiably a civil service should. But increasingly, with more in the hands of unelected bureaucrats, who in many cases are scarcely accountable to the electorate or to the elected government itself, that also creates a very strong sense of continuity, for better or worse.
Yeah.
Certainly you mentioned foreign policy. Until a few weeks ago, the State Department was largely run by the same people who ran it during the 1980s. And it's the same thing in the Treasury or in the Interior. This approach to both parties moving toward the center is indicative of this, the fact that many voters feel, when they look at the parties, if you really, really look, sometimes they're indistinguishable among each other.
Yes, that is a very long time complaint. I'm a former Tea Party person. The only reason I don't identify that as anymore is because it went a little off the rails in some places. Like, if you've ever been to a local Tea Party meeting, some of them end up just being, conspiracy theory exchange places. But basically, a big complaint they all had is that, the Republican Party is full of rhinos. Republicans in name only. Everyone's going to the left. And that was definitely a big perspective of a lot of the Tea Partiers, is that our party has gone too far to the left.
And by the same token, I am a former occupier, and I, even though I wasn't a super left-winger, I did believe firmly in the need for radical change and accountability in the financial sector, and the government's failure to address the concerns as they were becoming apparent. And in both of these cases, we come from pressure movements that made a splash in American politics, and I think this brings us to another issue as to why the mainstream parties that have squatted in the center have begun to collapse. In the U.S., the Tea Party was able to actually compel the Republican Party to an extent to adopt policies, which created a weird sense of identity crisis in the Republican Party, especially during the Obama years. Yeah. I remember hearing the accusation from some that former Speaker of the House John Boehner or former Majority Leader Eric Cantor were too left wing, which nearly caused me to pass out because I was thinking, if you think these men are left wing, but at the same time, there was there was a point there to many people who are right wing conservatives. The Republican Party's adoption of centrist politics in government, once they've been elected, what they say on the hustings
rhetorically, yes,
is one thing, but certainly in power, they have adopted many centrist policies. They were right that to them Boehner or Cantor may have been too left wing, but by the same token, in the Democratic Party, we've had, you said rhinos, we've had people that are labeled dinos, Democrats in name only, but the Democratic Party has been a more unwieldy coalition. And I think that never was that more apparent than the Democratic primary that lasted from 2014 into 2016, which really laid bare, a left-wing part of the party that did not feel it was being represented, and a more establishment part of the party, which was a tension between the left, the soft left, and the center left, or actual center. And I think that, as we saw in the general election here in the U.S., that many of those that were on the soft left supporting Bernie Sanders, many of them heeded his call to vote for Hillary Clinton, but still, again, many also opted to vote for Jill Stein. Many voted for Gary Johnson. Some even voted for Donald Trump, which utterly baffles me. And then again, many also simply stayed home. This kind of disaffection with mainstream parties is not merely being felt here. We see in Greece's old mainstream parties, the old Socialist Party, the old Conservative Party, they're gone virtually from national politics. They're still in the syntagma, but they're not in power, they're not in government. They have no chance, really, anytime soon, because they've been so discredited with their mismanagement on both sides of the crisis. Incidentally, the reason I said 2008 is the real start of this realignment is because the economic crisis that began in 2008 really laid bare the inadequacies of the existing structures to respond to the crisis, to mitigate its effects, or to prevent it. And the responsibility for that is something that lay at the hands of the mainstream parties, the people who've been in and out of power the last 30 years. And when we look then here, it's different. We have a first past the post system. Our parties are giant monolithic institutions. They're not really attached or dependent on movements of people to support them. The parties will change position when it suits them or when they need to, but the parties are institutions unto themselves.
Yes, that is. The parties, I've always found that party structures and where the part and power within the parties always center always tends to reflect the actual structure of power within the government itself. Like today, the political parties I found that they're very top-down centric in terms of power. Whoever's at the head gives marching orders down the line. That's one of the reasons I was concerned about Trump winning the party's nomination. I am a registered Republican at the moment, and what I was concerned with Trump winning is that he's going to give marching orders to the rest of the party, especially if he won the election. And I was just super concerned about that. He made it seem like he was going to be unelectable, but all that aside, I think it's probably something similar going on with the Democratic Party as well. Whoever is at the top gives marching orders to those down below, and that's of course because they model themselves based on what the power structure within the federal government is. The president is all powerful, therefore we have to make our parties match that in order for us to better have a chance of actually obtaining said power.
And I myself am a Democrat, and I've voted Democrat since 2008. But something I will say is in my party right now, where we are in opposition at the federal level, literally everywhere, it doesn't do us any favors that our senior leadership, right now, the Democrats who speak for the party nationally are people like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, who have spent many years in public service and have served their individual constituency as well, I would say. But at the same time, Chuck Schumer became leader of Democrats in the Senate, the minority leader, simply by virtue of being the senior Democrat. There was no open discussion or election or input from, ordinary Democratic voters. Had there been, it certainly would not be Chuck Schumer in that post. It would be someone like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders in that post. By the same token, Nancy Pelosi in the House of Representatives, where she's been the Democratic leader for nearly 2 decades, I want to say. But she has presided over how many lost elections in the House. And this is not to undercut or diminish their achievements and their service to their country and to their party. But if the party is to be able to respond to the change that voters clearly want, even though Bernie Sanders didn't win the primary, it aroused enough of an interest in politics that people see that if the country needs to change, the party has to change with it if it's going to be able to lead that change. And neither Schumer nor Pelosi are capable of doing that. But there is no, despite being the Democratic Party, there is no democratic outlet or structure to say who's going to speak for us at the national level.
Yeah, that was the ironic thing that everyone in the Republican Party was saying, oh, the Democratic Party calls themselves Democratic despite having superdelegates I can't remember what the numbers of a one superdelegate's vote is worth X number of regular votes.
It's a pretty high proportion, but something I will say about the superdelegates is that historically, the superdelegates have never been used to subvert the expressed intentions of American voters or the Democratic voters in a primary. The superdelegates have almost always, at least as a bloc, as a whole, cast their votes with the majority.
Yeah. The funny thing is that after the last 2012 election, the GOP changed their rules within their primary system to make sure that someone like Donald Trump couldn't win.
Whoops.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what we've seen here, and I think we're going to continue to see this for some time, is that in Europe, we'll see the continued erosion or collapse of certain establishment parties. We've already seen it in Greece. We are gradually beginning to see it in Spain, and to an extent in France as well, where currently in France the Socialist Party, which is in power, is polling at the beginning of the year was polling in 5th place out of I think 5 or 6 parties, and may have climbed its way to 4th. But there's this increasing sense of disillusionment. The principal Republican Party in France, which is, as here, the conservative, the traditional center-right mainstream conservative party, is polling now in 3rd or 4th, with the Trump-esque Front National candidate polling in 1st place, but hopefully won't win in a second round of the election. Austria. Austria's two traditional parties that put forward candidates for the president last year, both were knocked out, leaving a Green Party candidate and a far right, an alt-right candidate, which the Austrians resoundingly rejected the far right candidate. But we're seeing this shift in politics as voters are increasingly getting fed up. Before disaffectation was the norm. Turnouts were low. We've had increasingly high turnouts in some parts of this country. And I think that the parties here will have to listen to voters. And I think they're going to, because the parties are so monolithic that we can't simply create a third party that is going to overtake either of these anytime soon. The parties will be more than likely be forced to change from within.
Yeah. Now, back in January, I wrote an article for casualhistorian.com in which I gave my predictions based on previous American presidencies about what this Trump presidency might look like. Everyone wanted to compare him to a dictator. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go with an actual former U.S. president, see what scenarios are most likely. The one I felt was most likely is, I referred to that scenario as the era of bad feelings, or the reverse Monroe, where the Monroe administration was a time period of which, internationally speaking, everything was fairly calm. There was some stuff going on in places, but overall, for the United States, it was a fairly calm foreign policy. There's also, domestically, things were also very calm. We had just, quote-unquote, won a war with the British, in which... That's why they're, I have to say quote unquote, because air quotes don't work well in an audio format. And so, anyways, they had just won a war against the British, and everyone was pretty much on the same point. For almost a decade, the country was a virtual one-party state. The Federalists basically ceased to exist by the time Monroe sought a second term.
The War of 1812 is what killed the Federalists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the Federalist Party is virtually gone. You had the Jeffersonian Republican Party. It was the only party that could actually compete. Everything was hunky-dory. There was a sense of optimism and a kind of nationalism at the time, and things were fine. But the reason I decided to use the term era of bad feelings, which of course the Monroe administration is often referred to as the era of good feelings, is I believe what we're seeing now is the reverse of this. We're seeing, of course, everything is very chaotic abroad, at least it seems if you're looking at it on a day-to-day basis. Everything is getting a lot more ugly in terms of the domestic politics. There's not a sense of optimism, not a sense of unity, and only a part of the country has a sense of nationalism. And so the big part of the prediction I saw from this is that the overall prediction for the election I made is that whoever won was only going to serve one term. But as part of this era of bad feelings idea I developed, is that I think we're going to see 2 or 3 single-term presidencies in a row because of how divided everything is right now. And I think this is all going to be part of this process of realignment/de-alignment that we see going around the world. Basically, we're all going to need some time to get our very negative feelings towards each other figured out.
I think that you're absolutely right in terms of the general feelings of pessimism being present, and it's present across the country, regardless of political persuasion. There's not a sense of optimism. There's not a sense of pride, really, in anything, in a lot of ways. And I think that what we are definitely seeing is a strong sense of the politics of grievance. Where people are really, really fed up with feeling marginalized, feeling left behind. And what's really fascinating is that this feeling of marginalization, this feeling of being left behind, this feeling of being ignored or exploited, some people might say, "Oh, that's with those left-wing snowflakes." And, of course, we see it, in traditionally left-leaning areas, urban areas or the coastal regions. But we're also seeing it in Middle America. We're seeing the flyover states too, where deindustrialization has left swaths of people unemployed. And I think that the challenges that the parties face is the need to understand that business as usual cannot continue. And I think that this election in the United States last year was so telling because you had the two big parties. You had Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and Hillary Clinton does beat had a several million voter lead on Trump, but still lost. But it's also important to note that no candidate won a majority of voters, which means that whoever won, had it been Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, there literally would have been more Americans who voted against that person than for them. And that creates a democratic deficit, which shakes faith in our institutions and the way our democracy conducts itself. And I think, heaven knows, that if we are to go forward and your prediction of a one-term presidency, I am very optimistic that will hopefully it'll only be one term, for God's sake. But I also looking back at our American political trends the last few decades, we've only had since Ronald Reagan came to office only one president who's ever served just one term. And even then, that was really just a third term of Reagan. And that was George H.W. Bush from 1989 to 1993. But I think that, the 2020 election, well, really this election too, but the 2020 election especially, is the Democrats to win or lose. And a big part of whether or not they're going to be able to win in 2020 is that they can't simply say, look, you guys put Trump in last time. Well, you guys didn't. The system put Trump in last time, and we've got to move past the politics of fear. It didn't help us. It helped Trump to an extent, but it did not help us as Democrats. We have to be able to present, and I'd say this applies to Republicans too, need to be able to present an optimistic view of the future rather than dwelling on the grievances and fears of the present and the past entirely. Because otherwise there's a toxicity about our political discourse right now that is...
Yeah. And I've said this several times before, and I need to say it again. I don't think this can change until we get things like executive power roped in. Because as long as there is something that big at stake, the extremes are going to be far more powerful.
Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right on that. It's especially here. I've and you know this. I've long been a fan of moving toward a more legislative heavy branch. I'm not an originalist by any stretch of the imagination, but it is worth noting that when you have the three branches of government laid out in the Constitution, the longest section goes to the legislature. I think that one of the other problems too that we have is the notion of competing mandates, and that's something that certainly plagued the United States during the Obama years from 2011 forward, because when you have a president who's elected, popularly by the people, he has a mandate to govern, especially if he's managed to win a majority both of voters and electors. But when you have a legislature which is of the opposite party, which also is elected by the voters, who has the mandate to govern? Who has the mandate to guide the country? And one of the weaknesses of our system is that there's no definition of a priority of mandates, which hampers things from getting done in any direction. But I think that going forward, party structures need to become more open and democratic. I don't think that's going to happen, though, mostly because, as other friends of mine and I have, really been raising the case for things like proportional representation or, alternative voting. The parties have no interest in that. The parties as institutions, not as movements of interest or of policy, but as institutions, have no interest in seeing their power or influence reduced.
Yeah, this is going to be one of those areas where it's going to require a large citizen-led movement for this to happen. It's going to happen from the bottom up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that citizen movements, we've seen some upstart movements. The Tea Party, I think, would have been an excellent example. I don't think the Tea Party should have bothered with the Republican Party at all. I think the Tea Party actually probably could have and should have formed an external movement with a party that could have marshaled a great deal against, put pressure on the GOP in that way, in the same way Occupy could have, with better organization, become a new party of the left. Same thing for, I think, Bernie Sanders' soft left movement.
Well, the Occupy type movements always felt that they weren't going to get very far, mostly because you walk down one of the aisles of these Occupy protesters and you see sign like one side says, it's like end the war or end Wall Street, and then next to them is free healthcare and free Palestine.
It was a bit of a wide ranging. Occupy Wall Street was originally about holding the financial system to account for its role in the provoking a global crisis, but it rapidly had trouble maintaining message. And I'm not certainly some of the concerns that are being raised by my former Occupy colleagues are certainly ones that are valid things that do occupy that are prominent in the minds of people today. But the thing that really hampered the Occupy movement was that they were too decentralized in structure. there was a common algia hierarchy. The Occupy movement was really a left libertarian movement, so it was never in a position where it could exert pressure on the Democrats to act in a certain way. Certainly, the continued existence of Chuck Schumer, well known as a Wall Street Democrat in his seat, is an example of that.
Yeah. It says, so I think we're running to a point where we might want to wrap this up. And I'd say what I would like to point to is I think we should look at a positive example in the world of where these politics are not as nasty, not as bad, and possibly a good example to look at. And the one I would like to point to is in New Zealand, where things are pretty damn calm. I mean, you had, their now former Prime Minister John Key peacefully hand over power to a successor when he was on a high, rather than most of the time in politics where power gets passed on when you've royally screwed up.
Yeah, the old adage that all political careers end in failure. There are exceptions. I think that's one of them. Yeah. But then again, I mean, it's New Zealand. Bad things don't happen in the Shire after Saruman is gone. But I think that one that I might point out. There are two that I'll point out. Both are European. One is Germany. And the reason I say Germany, wow, I just realized I am, on a history podcast about to hail Germany as an example of non-toxic politics. Right now, Germany has been governed by a grand coalition for several years, a coalition between Merkel, center-right Christian Democrats, and the Christian Social Union, and the left-wing Social Democratic Party of Germany. This would be like mainstream Democrats, mainstream Republicans coming together and actually governing. And Germany has been largely stable. There is an upstart challenge, a Trump-esque movement called Alternative für Deutschland, which, when translated, means alternative for Germany, if that was unclear to anybody. But they're not likely to make many much electoral headway against the incumbent. Either the Social Democrats or the Merkel coalition. The other one that I'll point out is Spain. Now, you might be surprised because before this podcast, I was talking with you about how Spain got to experience the joy of 3 consecutive general elections last year because they couldn't form a government. But the reason I look at Spain in this way is that even though Spain's politics, their parties are fragmented and too weak to form a government of their own, they disagree among themselves too much to form a coalition that can govern. The reason I look at them is that all of their major parties, from the left to the right, not one of those parties has been running on a platform of Euroscepticism, which often takes the form of dog whistle racism or anti-immigration feeling. Not one of them has been playing on bigotry. And so there's a sense of civility. There's certainly anger, especially about Spain's economic situation, the way the government has handled it or will handle it going forward. But the fact that, it's not one that scapegoats Muslims or immigrants or any external factor, I think is a refreshing one. And especially coming from, here where it's still an issue for some reason that immigrants are terrible and Muslims are all out to kill us, which is completely far off base. The same thing happening in the UK where anti-immigrant sentiment was whipped up, has been whipped up several times. Spain's refraining from bringing racism to the ballot box is refreshing.
Okay, well, I think that's a good note to leave out on. So I guess until next time.
Until next time, Grant.